Bank manager tears up the check of a young black woman, not knowing her mother is a millionaire CEO. The sharp rip of paper cut through the hum of conversation inside the crowded bank, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward the manager's desk where Preston Wells stood, his hand clutching two torn halves of a $45,000 check. Across from him, a young black girl, barely 16, stood frozen in disbelief. Amira Thompson's fingers trembled around the folder she was holding, the Harvard crest faintly visible on the documents peeking out. Preston looked at her with a smirk that carried more judgment than words ever could. "Nice try," he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You really expect me to believe this check belongs to you? Do you even know where Harvard is?" A nervous laugh broke somewhere in the line behind her. The humiliation hit like a wave, but Amira did not flinch. She stood still, her eyes locked on the torn paper lying on the polished counter. Preston shook his head with mock pity. "People like you should really stop wasting our time," he added, his voice dripping with arrogance. "This kind of fraud can get you in real trouble." Amira bent down slowly, gathering the shredded pieces of her future, her silence cutting sharper than his insults. Her face gave nothing away. No anger, no tears, just quiet resolve. She pressed the pieces of the check against her chest and turned to leave, walking past the murmuring crowd. She did not say a word, but what she did next would rewrite his entire career. Preston's suspicion hardened into open hostility. He leaned across the counter, his voice rising as if the volume alone could prove him right. "Security!" he barked, snapping his fingers toward the nearest guard. "We might have a check scam here." The words sliced through the room, turning curious glances into judgmental stares. Amira's heart pounded, but her voice stayed calm. "Sir, this check came directly from Harvard's financial aid office," she explained, her tone polite but firm. "It is my scholarship disbursement. I am starting pre-med next semester." Preston scoffed, crossing his arms. "Harvard? For you?" He gave a sharp laugh that echoed through the lobby. "Harvard does not hand out checks to girls from your neighborhood. You expect me to believe a teenager like you earned $45,000 in scholarship funds? Do I look stupid to you?" The security guards approached, unsure but obedient. One of them hesitated, whispering, "Mr. Wells, maybe we should just verify." Preston cut him off. "I do not need verification to spot a scam." He waved them closer. "Escort her out before she causes more trouble." Amira looked at him for a brief moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit as the guards followed at a distance. The employees behind the counter avoided her gaze. A few lowered their eyes in quiet discomfort, but none spoke up. The only sound that followed her was the dull hum of the automatic doors closing behind her. Outside, the air felt heavier than it should have. Amira walked slowly, clutching the torn pieces of her check in her hand. She could still hear Preston's mocking laughter in her mind. Every step home felt longer than the last, and every heartbeat replayed his words. "Harvard doesn't hand out checks to girls from your neighborhood." When she reached home, the quiet of the house greeted her like a whisper of safety. Her mother, Dr. Tasha Brooks, was in her office, reviewing contracts on her tablet. She looked up immediately when she saw Amira's face. "You are home early," she said softly, noticing the unease. "How did it go at the bank?" Amira hesitated, setting her bag down on the table. The torn paper slipped from her hand and scattered across the floor. Tasha's eyes followed it, two halves of a check, her daughter's name printed clearly on them. She stood slowly, a tension tightening in her chest. "Who did this?" she asked quietly. Amira swallowed hard, her voice trembling just once before it steadied. "He said people like me do not go to Harvard, Mom." For a moment, Tasha said nothing. She simply stared at her daughter, the same girl she had raised to believe that brilliance had no color, that respect was not something you earned through skin tone or wealth. But now, standing there, she felt the burn of every barrier she had broken, every door that had once been slammed in her face. Her fury did not erupt. It settled, controlled, precise, the way only a powerful woman's anger could. "All right," she said finally, her voice calm but deadly in its focus. "If he believes people like us do not belong in Harvard, let us remind him exactly where we do belong." It was not loud vengeance she planned. It was strategy. Justice served the intelligent way. The next morning began quietly, But there was a storm building, one that only Tasha Brooks could control. She sat in her glass-walled office, sunlight spilling across the polished desk as her assistant, Daniel Ruiz, entered with a tablet in hand. "Dr. Brooks," he said carefully, "I've arranged your meeting with Rebecca Lang, CEO of Meridian Bank. She agreed to see you at noon." Tasha nodded once, eyes steady. "Good," she replied. "Let's remind them who built their walls of trust." Her words carried a quiet power. Brooks Tech, her company, wasn't just another tech firm. It was the company responsible for designing the cybersecurity systems that protected major banks across the country, including the very branch where Preston Wells worked. As Daniel left the office, Tasha sat back in her chair, her mind focused, but her heart heavy. She wasn't planning revenge. She was planning education, for a man who believed arrogance was authority. Meanwhile, across town, Preston Wells strutted through the bank lobby like a man who had just won a medal. "You should have seen her face," he told his colleagues, laughing loudly. "Came in here waving a fake Harvard check like I'd actually believe it. Some people need to learn their place." A few of his co-workers exchanged uncomfortable looks. One of the tellers whispered, "Are you sure it was fake, Preston?" "Maybe you should have checked." Preston cut her off with a smirk. "I don't need to check when my gut tells me the truth. That's what experience looks like." He leaned back in his chair, feet up on the desk. "Trust me, I did the right thing." But in the background, the security monitor blinked with alerts, real fraud attempts, flagged by Brooks Tech's system. Preston ignored them. He was too busy enjoying his own story. At home, Amira sat at the dining table, surrounded by textbooks, notes, and her laptop. The humiliation from the previous day still lingered, but she refused to let it define her. If they thought she didn't belong, she would learn exactly how their world worked. She pulled up online law journals and finance policies, reading late into the night. "Know the system," she whispered to herself, "and they can't use it against you." Her eyes burned from hours of study, but she didn't stop. While Preston bragged about teaching someone a lesson, Amira was preparing to rewrite the rules. Back at Brooks Tech, Tasha reviewed data files from Meridian Bank's security servers. Her team had been running diagnostics for months, routine maintenance, nothing suspicious. But now she saw opportunity in the ordinary. She called Daniel again. "Send Rebecca Lang my credentials summary before our meeting. Highlight the last 3 updates we did on Meridian's firewall network." Daniel hesitated. "Should I mention why you're meeting her?" Tasha smiled slightly. "No, let's keep that a surprise." She turned off the screen and looked out her office window at the city skyline. To her, this wasn't just business, it was personal. But she would never let emotion cloud her professionalism. Every move had to be calculated, every word deliberate. At the same time, Preston continued his parade of arrogance. He dismissed one employee for being too sensitive, scolded another for questioning his methods, and ignored the system's urgent warnings. When one of his junior analysts approached him with a report, "Sir, these accounts look suspicious, we may have a breach," he waved it off. "The system's overreacting again," he said. "Probably another false flag." He didn't realize that the system he was ignoring was hers. By mid-morning, Tasha was ready. Her assistant confirmed the meeting time, and she closed her folder with calm precision. "Daniel," she said, standing from her chair, "prepare my car." "Yes, ma'am," he replied. As she walked out, her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, a quiet rhythm of control and purpose. This wasn't just about her daughter anymore. It was about a culture that believed respect could be denied to those who earned it the hardest. And before the day ended, Preston Wells would learn exactly who he had underestimated. The following morning, Preston Wells received a message that left him uneasy. It was from the executive floor. Rebecca Lang wanted to see him immediately. The CEO never called him up before. He straightened his tie nervously, trying to convince himself it was about a promotion or maybe a compliance review. When he stepped out of the elevator, he noticed how quiet everything was. The hallway felt heavier than usual. The receptionist gave him a polite but distant nod before pointing to the glass conference room. Preston walked in and froze. Amira Thompson sat at the table, calm and composed. Beside her was Rebecca Lang, the CEO herself, her expression unreadable. And across from them sat Dr. Tasha Brooks, dressed in a navy suit, her posture sharp, her eyes steady. Preston blinked, confused. What is going on here?" he asked, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner than he intended. Rebecca motioned for him to sit. "Mr. Wells," she said evenly, "we need to discuss an incident that occurred yesterday at your branch." Preston swallowed hard. "Incident? I'm not sure what you mean." Rebecca pressed a button on her tablet. The room filled with the sound of voices, followed by the image of himself on the large monitor, standing in the bank lobby, holding a check, sneering, tearing it in half while customers stared. Every word echoed back at him. "Too young, too poor. Harvard doesn't hand out checks to girls from your neighborhood." The sound of paper ripping filled the silence that followed. Preston's face turned pale. That is not how it looks," he stammered. "It was a misunderstanding. I thought I was following protocol." Rebecca's expression did not change. She simply folded her hands on the table. "Protocol does not involve public humiliation, Mr. Wells." Amira remained quiet, her gaze steady but not angry. That calmness unsettled him more than any shouting could have. And then Tasha spoke. Her tone was soft, but every word landed with precision. "You judge my daughter by her color, not her credentials," she said. "While you were tearing her future apart, you were standing in a building my company secured." Preston's eyes widened. "Your company?" "Yes," Tasha replied. "Brooks Tech. We built the entire cybersecurity framework that keeps this bank operational. Every transaction, every client file, every layer of trust you depend on runs through systems my team designed." The weight of her words pressed down on the room. Rebecca added quietly, "And Brooks Tech also holds 12% ownership in this bank's digital infrastructure partnership. That makes Dr. Brooks one of our key stakeholders." The realization hit Preston like a blow. He had insulted, humiliated, and falsely accused the daughter of one of the most influential partners the bank had. He tried to recover. "Dr. Brooks, I did not mean to offend." "If I had known—" Tasha raised her hand gently, silencing him. "That is the problem," she said. "You only respect people when you know who they are. You did not see a young scholar with a Harvard scholarship check. You saw a stereotype." The silence that followed was thick with discomfort. Even Rebecca's usually composed face showed a flicker of regret. Preston's voice cracked. "I can apologize, publicly, if needed. I truly did not realize." Tasha did not raise her voice, but her calmness cut deeper than any anger could. "Apologies repair mistakes," she said. "Prejudice is not a mistake. It is a mindset." She turned to Rebecca. "The system you trusted failed the moment you hired people who see color before character." Rebecca's jaw tightened. She understood the weight of that statement, not just ethically but publicly. A scandal like this could destroy the bank's reputation overnight. After a long pause, Rebecca looked at Tasha. "We will handle this immediately," she said. "And I will ensure that your daughter receives the formal acknowledgement she deserves." Amira finally spoke for the first time, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "I don't want an apology," she said. "I just want to be treated the same way anyone else would be." Rebecca nodded slowly. "You will be." Preston sat in silence, the full reality settling in. Every arrogant word he had spoken, every smirk, every assumption, it all played back in his mind, now surrounded by the truth of who these women really were. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Tasha was already gathering her documents. She stood, looked at him once, and said softly, "Respect is not something you give after credentials are shown. It is something you offer because character deserves it." Then she turned to Amira. "Let's go." As they walked out, Preston remained seated, speechless, his career unraveling in the quiet hum of the boardroom's air conditioning. Rebecca stayed behind, arms crossed, staring at him. "You were right about one thing, Mr. Wells," she said. "People do need to learn their place, starting with you." Dr. Tasha Brooks did not speak right away. The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to silence even the hum of the air conditioning. Rebecca Lang sat still, her hands clasped together on the table, eyes fixed on Preston Wells, the man who, 24 hours ago, believed he was untouchable. Without saying a word, Tasha reached into her briefcase and placed two neatly organized folders on the polished surface. The quiet shuffle of paper sounded louder than any threat. "This," she said calmly, sliding the first folder forward, "is a $2.3 million discrimination lawsuit. It is fully drafted with supporting evidence, video, witness statements, and the transaction logs from your own branch." Preston's throat tightened. The color drained from his face as he opened the folder, and saw his own name printed on the front page. The number, $2,300,000, seemed to burn into his mind. "And this," Tasha continued, sliding the second folder across the table, "is your alternative. A voluntary resignation letter and a new inclusion policy proposal." Rebecca glanced at the documents, then looked back at Preston. "Dr. Brooks and I have agreed that this institution will begin funding annual scholarships for underprivileged students, along with a mandatory anti-bias and leadership reform program," she said. "If you sign the resignation, the lawsuit never leaves this room." Preston's hands began to tremble. I can fix this," he said weakly. "Please, I made a mistake." "I did not mean to—" Tasha cut him off gently but firmly. "You meant every word, Mr. Wells. The only mistake you made was assuming no one would hold you accountable." He lowered his eyes. The silence pressed heavier. Amira sat quietly beside her mother, watching the man who had mocked her just a day before. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet understanding that this moment was bigger than both of them. Preston stared down at the papers again. On one side lay ruin, public disgrace, legal exposure, a lifetime of debt. On the other side, surrender. He picked up the pen slowly, his fingers shaking. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, he signed his name. The sound of the pen scratching across the page was final, sharp, like the sound of a door closing forever. Rebecca took the paper, nodded once, and said quietly, "Effective immediately." Preston looked up at Tasha, eyes glassy, searching for some sign of forgiveness. But Tasha did not gloat. She simply gathered the folders and placed them back into her briefcase with calm precision. Then she turned to her daughter. Her voice softened, carrying warmth and power all at once. "People like him will keep existing," she said. "But every time they try to block your path, remember, you already own the ground they walk on." Amira's eyes glistened, not with tears of sadness, but of quiet strength. She nodded slowly, letting her mother's words settle deep inside. Rebecca stood and extended her hand to Tasha. "Dr. Brooks," she said respectfully, "thank you for handling this with grace. We will make sure this never happens again." Tasha nodded once. "I do not want revenge," she replied. "I want reform." The meeting ended without another word. Preston remained seated, staring blankly at the resignation he had just signed. The weight of his arrogance had finally collapsed on top of him. As Tasha and Amira walked out of the glass doors, there was no celebration, no satisfaction, only justice, steady and unshaken. Behind them, Preston sat alone, realizing that the world he had once looked down upon had risen higher than he could ever reach again. 6 months later, the world looked completely different for Amira Thompson. The air at Harvard felt cold and clean as she walked across the courtyard, books in hand, confidence in her stride. Students waved as she passed, not out of pity or curiosity, but out of respect. Her story, once a quiet humiliation inside a crowded bank, had become a symbol of strength and change. Amira had grown into a young woman who carried herself with grace and quiet authority. Her first semester grades were flawless, and she had recently been invited to speak at the university's Equality and Youth Empowerment Summit, a platform reserved for the most promising minds. When she stepped on stage that day, the audience rose to its feet even before she began. Her voice was calm but carried weight. "When people tell you that you don't belong," she said, "remember, it's not your job to shrink. It's their vision that's too small." The room erupted in applause, and within hours, clips of her speech flooded social media. News anchors replayed her words, students quoted her lines, and activists used her story as proof that quiet resilience can rewrite history. Meanwhile, far away from Harvard's bright halls, life had turned sharply for Preston Wells. The man who once commanded a corner office and barked orders now stood behind a small supermarket counter, wearing a cheap uniform with a faded name tag. The rhythm of the scanner's beep filled his days, an endless reminder of how far he had fallen. That afternoon, 2 customers stood near his register, watching a video on their phone. "Did you see this girl?" one of them said. "She's from Boston, the one who got humiliated at the bank last year. Now she's giving speeches at Harvard." Preston froze. He did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. The familiar name echoed through the air, Amira Thompson. His hand stopped mid-scan. The sound of her voice came faintly from the phone, the same calm tone he once mocked. Only this time, the world was listening. He felt his throat tighten. That single moment, the rip of a check, the smirk, the laughter, replayed again and again in his mind like a punishment that never stopped. When the customers walked away, he stared at the conveyor belt, the soft hum of the store around him fading into silence. There was no applause, no respect, no redemption waiting for him. Just the quiet consequence of arrogance. Back at Brooks Tech, Dr. Tasha Brooks stood in her glass office overlooking the city skyline. Her company had expanded across continents, now partnering with major banks committed to ethical leadership and fair employment. Her staff was larger, her influence stronger, but what she valued most was not power. It was the sight of her daughter thriving. Every year, the same bank that once tore her daughter's check now proudly ran the Amira Thompson Scholarship Fund, providing opportunities for young students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The program was featured in newspapers, praised by community leaders, and endorsed by Harvard itself. Amira never spoke publicly about the bank or Preston Wells again. She did not need to. Her success had already become the loudest answer possible. One quiet evening, as she walked across campus with her mother, they paused under the old lamppost where banners hung with her photo, smiling, confident, unstoppable. Tasha looked at her daughter, pride glimmering in her eyes. "You turned pain into purpose," she said softly. Amira smiled back. "You taught me how." They stood there for a moment, watching students pass by, laughter echoing in the cool night air. No cameras, no applause, just peace. Across town, Preston locked up the supermarket for the night. The street was empty. He caught his reflection in the dark glass door, tired eyes, worn hands. For the first time, he understood what respect truly meant, and how little his title had ever mattered. It's not your job to shrink. It's their vision that's too small. The best revenge is not shouting louder. It is succeeding so quietly that the world can't ignore your echo. The story fades on Amira's gentle smile as she looks at her mother. No words, just pride and peace glowing in their eyes.